This video is sponsored by Mantis Sleep. More about them later in the video. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's script was a combined effort between Karl Smallwood and Larry Holsworth, so be sure to show them some love in the comments as you deploy your likes. Subscribe and ring that bell if you haven't, and share this video with someone who loves learning about places and the fascinating history behind them. Let's get to it. Prehistoric America was the home of giant lumbering animals that traversed land in search of food, water, and salt. McDonald's hadn't been invented yet, you see. Much like us, these animals naturally wanted to expand the least amount of energy while searching out these resources, and followed paths of least resistance in their travels. In the process of doing this, the animals created wide trails through the primeval forests, trails which were later followed and improved upon by humans who, using our big human brains, realized that following the path pre-tread by animals who, on instinct and in some cases literally, moved as the crow flies, would be better than coming up with our own. The trails became connecting roads on which emerging communities engaged in trade and warfare and an expansion of the lands controlled by various tribes. Some of these trails were short paths through the woods, while others became interconnected and expanded over relatively large distances. When the Europeans first arrived in North America, what they perceived as a vast forest densely undergrown with vegetation was in fact crisscrossed with blazed trails that communicated with the towns and settlements of the natives. Many of these trails became highways to the west and south, used to reach areas of the country that were not serviceable by navigable waterways. Many of these trails gained the designation of traces, the word trace meaning a trail through woodlands. Among the longest east of the Mississippi River was a trail which became known as the Natchez Trace. The Natchez Trace became an important part of the early settlement of the American West and South in the decades between the American Revolution and the Mexican-American War in the mid-1840s. Some of the most famous names of American history were linked with the trace. Meriwether Lewis followed the trail to a death so mysterious that yes, it has of course been covered by true crime podcasts. Andrew Jackson relied on the trace during the War of 1812 during his campaigns against the Creek Indians, and later against those pesky, handsome, and well-endowed British, before the Battle of New Orleans. And yes, thank you, Karl, for giving me that mental image. Davy Crockett and his Tennessee Volunteers followed a portion of the trace on their way to meet their destiny at the Alamo. The Natchez Trace earned a reputation as a path to the lands along the lower Mississippi River, though it was a dangerous route. The hazards presented by the thick woods and rugged terrain the route penetrated were bad enough, but not the sole danger. The trace was liberally sprinkled with cutthroats and highwaymen, among them a notorious pair known to history as the Hart Brothers, considered to be the first serial killers in American history. True crime podcasts have also covered these. In the early days of the route's use by Europeans, Native American attacks were common. It was a path for those with enormous lead-lined balls and limited time, and hundreds did not survive, their bodies never to be found. Today, the Natchez Trace Parkway follows the route of the historic Natchez Trace. Its 444 miles of road traverse portions the current states of Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi, connecting the cities of Nashville, Tennessee, and of course Natchez, Mississippi. Throughout its length, portions of the old Natchez Trace are accessible, as are archaeological sites, historical markers, ruins, and other sites celebrating its past and the people who once lived, worked, and died along its route. As a business owner, getting quality sleep is essential for me to be able to function and get my job done on a daily basis. I'm not generally sensitive to light when sleeping, or at least I didn't think I was, but since trying my Mantis sleep mask, I've noticed my sleep is deeper and I feel a lot better after resting. I got the silk mask, and let me tell you, this thing is super comfortable. It feels so good to lay down with it. Normally it takes me about an hour to fall asleep, but with this mask I've been knocking out within minutes, and I tend not to wake up until my cat is pawing at my face. My wife loves her Mantis sleep mask too. She says it's very soft and easy to sleep with on her side, has an excellent battery life, seeing as how she hasn't charged it since opening it and has been using it for several weeks. And she loves the extra head strap and adjustability that keeps the mask from sliding down her head. The Bluetooth function is excellent and allows her to listen to her podcast before sleep without disturbing me. And it's all easily washable, since you can slide the Bluetooth parts out so you can wash the face part without worrying about damaging the electronics. Go to the link in the description and use code GEOGRAPHICS for 10% off your purchase. And big thanks to Mantis Sleep for the sponsorship. According to the U.S. National Park Service, the Natchez Trace is one of the oldest transportation routes in North America. The Park Service claims that evidence of human use of the route can be established as existing 10,000 years ago, a period when humans were mostly hunter-gatherers. While attempting to move through the dense forest, these early humans frequently resorted to the paths literally beaten down through the forest by great beasts, which, for the most part, followed the contours of the hills and ridges to gain access to drinking water, salt licks, and fields for grazing. In essence, the animals, in an effort to conserve energy in case they encountered a predator, created the very thing that would let the most tenacious hunter of all pursue them all the more effectively. What is now central Tennessee was lousy with salt licks and salt marshes. Modern researchers and historians believe that the migratory paths traversing the Natchez Trace were largely created by big-ass fuzzy bison, which moved northwards from Mississippi along a ridgeline to reach the salt necessary for their survival. They were followed by smaller animals, including deer, traveling in herds. This movement of game attracted the attention of humans, many of whom established settlements along the way. Among the early settlers were various peoples known today as mound builders, from the ceremonial and burial mounds they constructed. We actually talked about such a mound recently, and the numerous bizarre theories about their origins. Spoilers, it was probably not aliens. In regards to the mounds found along the Natchez Trace, many of them were lost to the plow in the 19th century. Back to the early settlers of the area, they both used and improved the animal trails, leading to them becoming interconnected paths reaching small settlements. As the population increased, so did the size of some settlements, and the importance of the trace increased with the need for trade, communication, and a place where it was possible to saunter jauntily under dappled sunlight, one of life's cheapest and greatest pleasures, especially whilst listening to an Iron Maiden album. By the mid-18th century, the trace was known to European explorers and the long hunters and trappers who pushed into what was then the West, though it was not yet known as the Natchez Trace. By the late 18th century, the trace was widely referred to as the Chickasaw Path, named for the dominant tribe in the lands it traversed. A Chickasaw leader named Pia-Mingo, sometimes called Pia-Minko, used the trace to travel through the region, visiting other tribes and smaller bands in attempts to unify them against the influence of the Spanish in Louisiana, and align them with the newly born United States. Pia-Mingo was a personal friend of George Washington, going back to the latter's day as a colonel of militia in the colony of Virginia. Pia-Mingo's use of the trail became so frequent that the route became known as Pia-Mingo's Path in the 1780s, a name which was used in official documents of the US government and in Congress. A testament to the length of the penis Pia-Mingo was metaphorically swinging around at the time. But then the route ran from the southern branch of the Wilderness Road just outside Nashville to the site of the Natchez settlements in Mississippi. Pia-Mingo died in or about 1799. But the exact circumstances of his demise are uncertain. Whatever the case, following his death, the by then well-established pathway through the forest became known as the Natchez Trace, even though objectively this sounds less cool than Pia-Mingo's Path. The name likely evolved from its western terminus at Natchez, while a trace was a common reference for a path through the woods. Already several centuries old, its part of American history was just beginning. Following the American Revolution, the lands of what were then considered the Northwest and Southwest were open to American settlement. In the Northwest, the national boundaries bordered British Canada. In the Southwest, the boundaries abutted Spanish Louisiana and what were then the two Floridas. Yes, there was a point in American history where there were two Floridas, a frightening thought. In between were vast lands ripe for settlement. Roads were scarce. Improved roads suitable for wagons and carriages were virtually non-existent. The main means of travel through the newly opened territories was via the rivers. The problem with the rivers such as the Ohio, its tributaries, and the Mississippi was the direction of the current. Traveling downstream with the current was no problem, you just followed the stream. But returning upstream proved exceedingly difficult. Perhaps one day they'll come up with a term for this. Early boatmen operated simple boats that were little more than barges with a small deckhouse for shelter. It became common for boatmen to journey downriver to Natchez, where cargo was offloaded and then the boats sold, or broken apart for lumber, which was then sold. The boatmen would then return to civilization, such as it was, via the Natchez Trace, walking or on horse or mule. With luck, the 450-mile journey could be completed in about a month. They would then build or buy a new boat and then do the whole thing over again. Which sounds just awful. We mean, even Sisyphus got to rest when he watched the boulder roll down the hill, and we imagine the walk down the hill was at least pleasant. The same can't be said for the walk back along the Natchez Trail. As you might imagine, walking back along a dark and lonely several hundred-mile long road with a pocket full of cash made these boatmen easy pickings for highwaymen. They were common, and because dead victims can't snitch, they were merciless. The journey to Nashville began not in Natchez itself, a sedate, genteel town built on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River, but in a section known as Natchez Under the Hill. It was there, below the city, where the riverboats docked, the cargoes were handled, and the boatmen and other travelers landed. The area was populated with dock workers, boatmen, adventurers, gamblers, cut purses, prostitutes, and other ne'er-do-wells. Cheap whiskey and other alcohol flowed freely, opium dens were common, and smugglers and spies prowled about, learning the travel plans of those preparing to begin a journey along the trace. A man known to be a murderer wanted in Tennessee could walk about freely in Mississippi, unwanted by the local authorities. Many did, and used this time to, of course, plan more crimes, usually aiming their sights at the newly wealthy boatmen swaggering into towns looking for a well-earned drink. The Lafitte brothers, suspected pirates and known smugglers of goods and slaves, frequented Natchez Under the Hill. So did James Bowie, yes, the knife guy, another legendary American icon with a somewhat checkered career. Many highwaymen moonlighted as river pirates, essentially giving them two chances to rob the same person. Among these were Samuel Mason, who ran a notorious den of thieves at Cave-in Rock along the Ohio River in Illinois, as well as perpetrating numerous robberies and murders along the Natchez Trace. Among his minions for a time were Micajah and Wiley Harp, widely considered America's first serial killers. The pair, who may have been brothers or may have been cousins, admitted to more than 36 murders over the course of their career, many along the Natchez Trace. It was in a cabin near the trace where Micajah Harp murdered his own daughter, an infant, by crushing her skull against a hearth. Micajah was upset that the infant wouldn't stop crying, and yes, that sounds insane. He later claimed that it was the only one of his many murders that he felt any remorse for. So at least he had some standards, we guess. For the true crime aficionados out there, the usual modus operandi of the brothers was to violently gut their victim and then fill the corpse with stones before hurling it into the river. They'd also frequently further mutilate their victim, with it being unclear if this occurred post or perimortem. Perimortem, for those unfamiliar with the term, means that the injuries occurred around the suspected time of death, rather than after it. The pair would also show little regard for a victim's dignity, often stripping them naked or urinating on them. The Harps weren't the only pair of brothers who preyed upon travelers on the Natchez Trace, nor even, as unbelievable as it may sound, the most vicious, at least according to contemporary accounts. This said, the pair's actions were detestable even by the standards of literal murders, with the Harp brothers reportedly being kicked out of a gang for kicking people naked off a cliff rather than just robbing and stabbing them, as was the custom at the time. For the sake of not ending this section on a sour note, it may please people to know that both brothers eventually met with justice. Micajah was shot and tomahawked to death by a vengeful posse, while Wiley was eventually caught and hanged before his head was cut off and placed upon a large spike overlooking the very trail he'd terrorized. Now that's justice. As mentioned, the Harps weren't the only killers on the trace, or even the most vicious, with the trail also being the site of numerous kidnappings of enslaved people who were being marched to destinations along the route. James Bowie indulged in the practice of slave smuggling and kidnapping in company with his brothers and business partners John and Stephen. One scheme involved the kidnapping of slaves on the trace, returning them to Natchez, where they were immediately resold and shipped south to New Orleans. The Lafitte brothers, Jean and Pierre, indulged in a similar practice, stealing the slaves they themselves had sold and returning them for resale to other customers. In each case, disposing of the guards transporting the enslaved people was of little concern for the kidnappers. Bodies left in the woods alongside the trace were rapidly disposed of by the scavengers of the forest. Even with all of that, Jean Lafitte became a hero of the Battle of New Orleans, and James Bowie became one of the great heroes of Texas history after his death at the Alamo. more known for his skills with a knife than the unarmed innocents he killed with that knife. Such were those who lay in wait for the unwary traveler along the Natchez Trace at the beginning of the 19th century. It was then that President Thomas Jefferson decided to use federal funds to improve the trace, designating it as a postal road and assigning the U.S. Army to widen it and pave portions of it with logs. The Army began work on the project in 1801. The road was officially designated the Natchez Trace Postal Road, though those who traveled upon it usually referred to it as the Devil's Backbone, which is now a beer company. As the Army improved the road, the number of travelers upon it continued to increase, despite the rigors of the journey. The northward trek included a rise of over 1,000 feet into thick timberland, wholly untouched by the axe. At the time, the eastern hardwood forests were so dense that common lore was that a squirrel could travel from Louisiana to Maine without ever setting foot upon the ground. While that is possibly American chest thumping, it was nonetheless a massive virgin forest, a canopy of hardwoods which blotted out the sky for days at a time. Mile after plodding mile was in gloom, unrelieved by sunlight. Before reaching the hardwood forests, northbound travelers contended with the cypress swamps, nearly obscured creeks and streams, and the steaming humidity of the American South. Mosquitoes and other biting pests swarmed travelers, tormenting them ceaselessly as they walked or rode along the road. The waters harbored cottonmouth and water moccasins, and the woods were filled with copperheads and eastern rattlesnakes, all poisonous and all too common. A traveler provided his own food, his own sleeping arrangements, all at his own risk. Unless he was fortunate enough to reach one of the stands that began to appear along the trace in the early 19th century, another nod to American entrepreneurship. Stands were basically whatever the owner wanted them to be. A few were relatively comfortable inns, offering decent food, clean bedding, stables for horses, and other services. Most were less welcoming. Many of the eventually more than 40 stands along the trace offered little more shelter than a roof. Guests slept on the floor. Often, guests preferred to sleep outside, though, where it was less crowded and presumably the air was less scented with the farts of fellow travelers. One such stand owner announced his new business with an advertisement in the Mississippi Messenger, November 11, 1806. He called his stand a house of entertainment, which offered provender and provisions suitable for travelers. He also announced the attraction of a blacksmith shop. The establishment, which became known as Brashear's Stand, also served as the Indian agency for the Choctaw Indians, and eventually grew into the city of Ridgeland, Mississippi. Another stand, owned by Robert Evans Greiner and his wife Priscilla, was opened in 1807 in Tennessee. Its land had been ceded to Tennessee by the Chickasaw Indians, who maintained ownership of the land just feet away from the Greiners' property. Mr. Greiner's stand became known as Grinder's Stand through some quirk of local tongues, and it became arguably the most infamous of the stands along the Natchez Trace. The stand consisted of two rough log cabins, which stood at right angles to each other, connected with a covered breezeway, known in local parlance as a dog trot. A kitchen outbuilding stood behind the stand, and the property boasted a barn. The Greiners were poor. The stand did not generate much income, and Mr. Greiner subsidized his meager earnings by selling whiskey to the Chickasaw, with whom he spent most of his evenings. Mrs. Greiner performed most of the duties of hostess for travelers. In 1809, Grinder's Stand became famous when one of America's earliest heroes, Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark fame, chose to stay there while on a journey east to Washington. He has been there ever since. After becoming a national hero following the completion of the Lewis and Clark expedition, Meriwether Lewis suffered through difficult times. In 1807, Thomas Jefferson appointed his former personal secretary to serve as governor of the Louisiana Territory. Lewis established his headquarters in St. Louis rather than New Orleans, in part to provide better communications with Indian tribes to the west. He soon developed political enemies and rivals, at least one of whom accused him of malfeasance in his dealings with the Indians, as well as generating questions over expense reports when Lewis requested reimbursement for expenses he incurred while conducting government business. Communication with the western tribes was easier from St. Louis, but more difficult with Washington since most of it was via courier over land. Lewis's superiors in Washington, including Jefferson, found the slowness of the governor's responses to their queries disturbing, if not indicative of his guilt. In 1809, Lewis left St. Louis for Washington, bearing papers and diaries, which he said would establish his innocence and the truth of his claims, as well as the deliberate falsifications of his enemies. Lewis intended to journey to New Orleans by flatboat, and then by ship to Washington. For reasons never fully explained, he changed his mind en route, disembarked in Natchez, and continued along the Natchez Trace. He traveled with one servant, another companion who was a former servant, and carried in addition to his papers and diaries about $100 in cash. On October 10, 1809, he arrived at Grinder's stand. Mrs. Grinder welcomed the guest. Mr. Grinder was absent, at least in one version of her later story. Shortly after midnight, Mrs. Grinder claimed to have heard a shot, followed by a scream, followed by another shot. Entering Lewis's room, she found him with bullet wounds to his head and chest. Lewis's servant and Mrs. Grinder put the grievously wounded man to bed, and while the servant kept vigil, she returned to her own room. In her later story, she claimed that she returned to Lewis later in the morning and found him sawing at himself with his razor, the servant being absent. Lewis died later that day and was buried at Grinder's stand. A brief investigation by the local sheriff determined Lewis died by suicide. The weapon used was the only weapon found at the scene, a single-shot muzzle-loading pistol which belonged to Lewis. How exactly he managed to shoot himself in the head and chest with a single-shot pistol was not explained. His enemies in St. Louis and elsewhere claimed that Lewis had been despondent for some time and implied that he had self-medicated with opium. Jefferson, for anyone curious, accepted the suicide verdict. The papers Lewis had been carrying with him to vindicate himself were not found, nor was the $100 in cash Lewis had been carrying either. Shortly after the verdict of suicide, Mr. and Mrs. Grinder left their stand, relocated to western Tennessee, where the notoriously cash-poor couple exhibited newfound wealth. Interesting, right? Meriwether Lewis became one more casualty of the infamous Natchez Trace. The manner of his death is still debated, with more questions than answers arising from the dispute. The Natchez Trace, as a major thoroughfare, played a role in the War of 1812, when Tennessee militia, Army regulars, and Indian allies all used it when positioning themselves to defend the Mississippi Valley. After the war, use of the Natchez Trace declined steadily. In 1817, a new road begun by the Army during the war connected Nashville directly to New Orleans, bypassing the Trace. The following decade, the use of steam power on the rivers led to faster connections in either direction on the rivers, at least during those times when the rivers were fully navigable. Still, the Trace served a purpose, providing direct connections between the communities which had sprung up along its path. It returned to military prominence in 1863 during the American Civil War, when General Ulysses Grant abandoned his initial assault on the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Grant used the Trace to facilitate movement of his army while outmaneuvering the Confederate defenders, eventually trapping them in the city, which then underwent a 47-day siege. Vicksburg surrendered on July 4, 1863. Grant acknowledged the usefulness of the Trace throughout the campaign in his memoirs, published just before his death in 1885. After the Civil War, much of the Trace was simply abandoned, with the forest reclaiming large sections of the route. Yet large sections remained, used as local county and state roads in Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. It became known and is still known as, quite fittingly, the Old Natchez Trace. Nearby, following much of the same route, can be found the Natchez Trace Parkway. The parkway provides access to many of the sites once featured on the Natchez Trace. During the Great Depression, one of the many government organizations established by President Franklin Roosevelt was the Civilian Conservation Corps, known as the CCC. It proved to be one of the most popular of the New Deal agencies espoused by FDR, and one of the most successful. In 1939, the CCC began construction of the Natchez Trace Parkway, a limited-access two-lane highway following a route overseen by the National Park Service. The CCC is long gone, having been disbanded in 1942, but the parkway remains under the control of the National Park Service. In fact, some sections in Mississippi weren't fully completed until 2005. It follows closely the route of the Old Natchez Trace and provides access to remnants of the original Trace for recreational use. There are more than 350 archaeological sites accessible from the parkway and 22 ceremonial mounds built by ancient inhabitants of the region. The site where Meriwether Lewis committed suicide, according to the official findings, as well as his grave, are accessible from the trail. One can stand at the site and ponder the mystery of how he could shoot himself in the head with a nearly 3/4 inch in diameter bullet and live long enough to reload and then shoot himself again. Whereas early travelers on the Natchez Trace considered a month-long trek a successful journey, today a traveler can cover the 444-mile distance from Natchez to Nashville in about 11 hours. The entire parkway is encompassed by a national park, which consists of over 52,000 acres of wetlands, forests, prairies, and croplands. There are over 60 miles of foot and horse trails, most of which are on the old Natchez Trace. The routes taken by the relocated Indian tribes during the tragic relocation of the eastern tribes of the West, known as the Trail of Tears, cross the Natchez Trace at 4 different locations, all marked with signs and information and maintained by the National Park Service. There are also sites which explain the migration of the large beasts that created the original route followed by the trace, including sites which describe the mastodons and mammoths that once sought salt in the marshes and salt licks of central Tennessee. Today, one can cover the length of the Natchez Trace in relative ease and comfort. It's virtually impossible to comprehend the difficulties encountered by those who traveled it 2 centuries ago, when lethal danger lurked behind every shrub, and the odds of reaching one's destination at all were longer than the trail ahead. It's really nothing less than a miracle that anyone braved the dangers of the Natchez Trace for any reason. Traveling the trace was much more than the walk in the woods which much of the ancient road offers today. During its history, it claimed the lives of unknown hundreds, perhaps thousands of people. Men, women, children, white, black, Native American, you name it. Today, though, it is a haven for outdoor recreation, for those who love history, and for those who want to know more about how the America of today evolved. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a place we should cover next, subscribe and ring that bell if you haven't, and share this video with someone who loves learning about the history of places. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.